if the nature of childhood has changed, if the way children are learning today has changed, then the way we continue to teach them also has to change. It has to stay relevant to who they are, which means we've got to see this work as dynamic, as constantly, we've got to constantly reflect on the practice and ask ourselves whether or not we are succeeding at educating the children we serve. So with that in mind, I want you to now think about the children you serve and what the kind of assumptions we make about culture. Okay, and I'm going to use culture now in a different way. Culture relates to your background, whether that has to do with ethnicity or national origin or race. And I want to start by recognizing, I'm going to use a definition of culture that comes out of anthropology, which is really that it's a system of ideas that enable us to make meaning of phenomena in the social world. Okay. Because it's that system of meaning that gives meaning to our clothing, that gives meaning to our speech, that gives meaning to our dress, our taste. You only know when you're in a different culture, usually or what your culture is when you're in a different culture, right? Or when you're encountering and interacting with someone who's different, because there's no shared understanding. Right? That's why a lot of times we think the other person has the accent. What a strange accent, because we think we speak normal. They speak with the accent. Right? At the same time, all of us occupy numerous cultures simultaneously. The culture of work, the culture of the family, the culture of your sexual orientation, the culture of your religion. All of us are occupying numerous cultures. And for many of us, this is not a problem. We navigate these almost seamlessly. But for some of us, it may be more of a difficulty. Because when the cultures are more different, the strains and the stresses of transferring from one cultural setting to another can induce stress in a person. So for example, if you come from a home that's very religious, when you go to school where there are different norms in place, then there can be tensions because what's expected at home and what's expected in school is so far apart. So the greater the degree of cultural difference, often the greater the degree of stress and strain on the person. Okay, and helping people to navigate these strains and stresses is very important because, again, we often are not even aware of what they're going through because we see things from our cultural frame of reference. Can't help but doing that. The last thing we know, well, on this slide, is that we learn through shared cultural understandings. Vygotsky, the Russian linguist, talks about learning through the zone of proximal development. That is that part of learning, the reason it's easier to learn something if we can connect it to something that's already familiar. So one of the reasons why learning a language like Arabic or Chinese, Cantonese is so difficult if you speak a Romance language because the letters are different. It's the whole ways in which they use language is so different from something that's familiar to us. Okay. Not that it can't be learned, it's just more challenging. Okay. And it's also true that teaching is a cultural transaction. And that part of what makes the transaction work is the degree to which we know how to take ideas and concepts and skills and make them relevant and meaningful to the person at the other end. Right, so you ever have to stop and ask for directions in a strange place? You always got to be careful about who you ask, right? Because you don't want to waste your time, right? And you know, some people are just friendly, and they'll give you directions even if they don't know what they're talking about, right? They'll give you directions. And there are some people, they could talk and talk, and you will never understand what the hell they talked about because it doesn't make any sense to you. Because their ability to convey that knowledge to you is just too limited, or your ability to receive it is too limited. Well, there's some kids who are in classrooms where they just can't figure out what you're saying, right? Because the degree of alignment, the degree to which we're able to communicate in ways that are meaningful to them are limited. But I just want to acknowledge that this is an important part of teaching because it's really the medium through which we learn. When there are cultural mismatches, when there's a difference in culture between the person who's teaching and the people who are learning, there are often tensions. Often tensions. To a large degree because we tend to view differences in culture as a sign of deficiency. If you're not like me, then you're not quite as good. Not always. Some of us learn to respect differences, but a lot of us, if you don't do it like me, not as good. Okay? And that judgment, that tendency to judge, is a fairly common human tendency. Okay? But it has serious and often severe implications for teaching, when we are teaching children who are from a different background than us. And I'm not to say, I'm not a cultural relativist. I know that we all have differences, right, in how we do things. And we might decide, well, some differences, I think this way is better, actually, okay? And I think that's a whole other topic we could debate about whether or not there are certain cultural practices and traditions that are problematic and really should be changed. That's another topic. But I just want to acknowledge here that when there's a difference, it often affects our ability to teach and to communicate, because we don't know how, and our judgments and our tendency to make judgments based on those differences often kicks in. We also know that those differences, when they're there, often become manifest in communication problems and behavior problems. And almost always, when I find a classroom that's out of control, where kids are acting out, what I almost always look to is, how does that teacher communicate with the children? Not to say that I'm blaming the adult, because there are challenging children out there, right, who have special needs and who present, particular challenges to us. But when you find consistently that this adult has trouble with a population of kids, it's often because they simply don't know how to relate to those kids. I'll give you one short story to illustrate the point. Working with a school in Oakland, California. They have a brand new teacher from Teach for America. How many Teach for America graduates there? Okay, a couple. All right, good to see you. So you know the profile. They're young, they went to a good college, they're idealistic, they're very briefly trained, and then they're sent into very difficult schools. So she's working in a school in Oakland, and she comes up to me one day and she says, I'm having trouble with classroom management. She said, no one's been willing to help me. Could you give me some pointers, come observe me? And I said, sure, I'd be happy to come into your classroom. So I sit in the classroom. After a few minutes, it's clear it's far worse than she described. Total chaos in the room. Kids are screaming, there's yelling. At the end of the period, she turns to me, she said, well, you see what I'm talking about? I said, yeah, this is bad. She says, well, I can't take it anymore. I'm about to quit. I'm going home with migraines every day. So let's go to see the principal. See if the principal can help. So together we go see the principal, and she explains what's happening in the classroom. The principal listens. At the end of a conversation, she says, you're a professional, deal with it. Then I speak up, and I say, listen, if you don't help her, she's going to quit. It's March. If she quits now, you'll have to get a sub for the rest of the year. So that alarms her, no, I don't want that. He said, I have an idea. We have a veteran teacher who's just retired from the school. She's great with kids, and she's available as a substitute now. I'm going to ask her to come back to take over your classroom for a few days. I can only afford a few days, but I think you might pick up some things from watching her. So both the new teacher and I think, well, it's the best idea we've heard, only idea that seems to make any sense, let's try it. So the next day, the veteran teacher shows up. And there's something about the walk, something about the look she gives, but the kids can tell almost instantly the real thing is here today. So the classroom was previously out of control is suddenly on task. Kids are working, normal classroom, they're engaged. Math class, she's there teaching. New teacher and I are shocked. They can't believe this has happened so quickly. At one point during the lesson, though, she sees two girls talking. So she stops what she's doing. She says, young lady, when I'm speaking, I want you to be quiet. She goes to write on the board, and under her breath, the girl says, bitch. But not a direct bitch. Indirect. Do they use that word in Sweden? You know that word. So the veteran teacher stops what she's doing. She says, young lady, do I look like your mother? And the girl reacts like that. She's like, no, you don't look like my mother. And she says, whenever you speak to me, I want you to think of your mother. And she goes back to the lesson. Girl goes back to work. Class does not miss a beat. New teacher turns to me and says, how did she know that that would work? My question to you is, what does the veteran teacher know that the new teacher doesn't? But she didn't know those students. They weren't her students. She knew something about the culture, that environment. She worked in that school, that community. Do you think she might have got that technique in grad school? She pulled that out and said, I remember when they call you. What does she know about these kids that the new teacher doesn't? Culture. But she also knew these kids know better. She knew that if she simply was comfortable with her own authority and reminded this girl, that's not happening here, the girl actually would go along and work with her. Okay? New teacher thought she was teaching wild children that needed Valium or some kind of drug to calm them down. The veteran teacher didn't cite the rules. There must be a rule against bitch calling. Why not cite the rule? Why doesn't she cite the rule? The kids know the rule? Is there any school in America where you could, or in Sweden for that matter, where you can curse at teachers? No. But the children will push, they will test, they will challenge, because this was really a test. They wanted to know, how is she going to respond? She doesn't call the dean. Why doesn't she call the dean? Why doesn't she get some backup here? I need a backup. They called me a bitch in here. I need somebody to help me now. Why not get some help here? Huh? It's disempowering to the teacher. If one little bitch sent you for help, you really are, you're lost here, aren't you? If that's all it took to get you to scamper off,